Good evening. My name is Rani Avisar. I'm the Dean of the school. It's my true pleasure to welcome everybody this evening. And in particular, I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Falkowski. I heard, in fact, speaking with him, that he was a real firefighter. So I think that he knows what he's talking about. And I want to take this opportunity also to recognize that we have with us in the audience other firefighters that are doing the real hard job of making that, helping our communities. I think that it's not a secret that a lot is going on nowadays, and the recent fires in California is just a demonstration of the importance of these activities and our capability to predict them and be able to deploy the appropriate forces to eliminate them. As I mentioned, Dr. Falkowski is here. We have also Sarah Straka. Sorry, I forgot the family name for a second. Sarah is with us also, and I'll introduce her in a minute. Before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of this series. Without that financial contribution, we would not be able to maintain it over the years. This is the 30th year that we are having this series. And as you know, it's dedicated for our citizens around the school. And we are very, very happy to have been able to continue presenting that series every year for the past 30 years. So among the sponsored, we have the presenting sponsor, which is the Norwegian Cruise Line Holding. We have the Shepherd Broad Foundation, Bill Galway III, Cheryl Gold. We have the KB Life Enhancement Forum, the Key Biscayne Community Foundation, the John McCuffin Family Foundation, Nicole and Myron Wong, and Southern Glazers Wine and Spirit. I have seen Bill is here, Cheryl is here, Nicole and Myron are here as well in the audience. And again, thanks for sustaining this program. So, as I was mentioning, it has become a tradition for us before we listen to the main presentation to have an alumni come back and tell us about their experience at the school and what they are doing. So we have with us this evening Sarah Straka. Sarah got her undergrad at Robert Morris University. It's a university in Pennsylvania. And then after completing her undergrad degrees, she came to Miami, to the University of Miami, where she got a degree in atmospheric science and in environmental science and policies. And since then, she has been working on multiple projects, including data analysis on several research projects at here. And she assisted in producing the first climate symposium in 2020. She also worked with the Miami-Dade County Office of Resilience. And now she's involved again at the University of Miami on a project that is involved with decadal climate scenarios. And she's focusing on the community engagement and the stakeholder collaborator. Under her leadership, she developed also what is known as the Resilience Pod, and it's a mobile education center made from a recycled shipping container, and it has traveled all over the county and serves as an education platform on climate change, sustainable practices, and resilience tactics. So, Sarah, if you would please.
Yes, thank you so much for having me here and allowing me to share my journey with you all. I have definitely had an unconventional path to get to where I am currently. So we're not going to start quite at the beginning, but I want to make sure that it comes in full circle. So to start, I want to express to you my interest and obsession, actually, at a young age with the weather. And I had this assignment in grade school that, as the author of that book, and that shows you I was not going to be an art student. However, in the bio of the author, it says, "In the future, I hope to be a scientist." Well, it didn't go a direct path to that, as I initially got my degree, a bachelor's degree in marketing and communications. I then moved to Miami, where my personal experience drove me to want to go back to school and pursue weather finally. So after coming to Miami, you can see on the right what I experienced. This was the first experience that actually triggered me to start paying a lot more attention to what was going on around me and to see that climate change was in fact directly affecting areas. Specifically, my car was totaled that day. That's an actual picture outside of my apartment. That was the first awakening that I had coming from Pennsylvania. But that didn't quite do it. In 2012, Superstorm Sandy is really what made me want to go and pursue weather. And that is because of the forecasting challenges that storm presented, as well as the fact of the devastation that we saw on the Northeast coasts. And that was the game changer for me. And I then applied to the University of Miami, was accepted, and began in the fall of 2013. Initially, I didn't see where my 2 degrees actually connected, so I didn't fully understand. I thought my first degree in marketing and communications was going to become obsolete at that point. Once I obtained a degree in atmospheric science, that was my path, and that was it. But actually, after obtaining that degree, we were going into times similar to the times we are in now, where we are kind of under attack, science is kind of under attack and being highly politicized. So science communication came to the forefront, and I started to see at that point after graduation where that was going to become my strong point in having both a background in communications and science, and being able to translate that technical information to communities who needed to understand it better. And I also wanted to bring up that where we're at now in 2025, this is the World Economic Forum, and they put out global risks to society every year. This was put out in January of 2025. And for the second year in a row, we are now standing where misinformation and disinformation is the #1 risk to society over the next 2 years in the short term. So not only are we as scientists having to go out and explain to everyone what we do and why it's valuable, but we have to counteract the conspiracy theories and false narratives that are out there as well. So that definitely makes things more challenging. However, I do like a challenge. So that brings me to what I've been doing for the past almost 5 years now, which is the Resilience Pod. And that is a communication tool I've been using for that time. It is a retrofitted, beautifully decorated shipping container that goes around the county and educates people on climate change, resilience, and sustainability. Our launch was March of 2020, so that was not ideal. That was what it was set, but we were not actually predicting a pandemic at that point. We did have to pivot and stay resilient, and what we did is we teamed up with food drives at that time. And while people were driving through and obtaining a box of food for the week, we were giving away a fruit tree and teaching people that this was a sustainable food source, and teaching them the importance of that and giving them that tangible asset to take home and learn from. And because, to be honest, growing food is a skill. It is not something that just happens. You have to practice it and work at it. And I've learned that after doing it for countless years now. I can't tell other people that they're able to do so if I can't do so myself. So this tool is super resourceful in what I do. first of all, being mobile, because I can meet my audiences where they are. And then second of all, we are solar powered. So initially the design was to be small scale disaster relief, in that when after a hurricane would hit, we would be able to deploy into vulnerable communities and offer them solar power and Wi-Fi to reconnect with the world quicker than maybe where they were on the list to initially be able to. We've been very fortunate in Miami to have not had to deploy for that reason. However, we've just been going around for almost 5 years now and educating people on climate change resilience and sustainability. So being able to meet audiences where they are and reach an audience that maybe were not seeking out this information has been highly resourceful. These are just a few of the stats that we've achieved over time. We've reached over 500,000 people, given away 85,000 trees, seedlings, and seeds, and we've deployed actually now over 58 times, because we just deployed on Sunday at another event. So I will leave you with a very important quote that sits with me as a science communicator, and that is, I always thought if I communicated enough, there would be change, but that's not the case. You can communicate until you run out of breath, but if there's no comprehension, your words are useless. And so you can use that QR code to reach my contact information, and I would gladly answer any questions you may have if we have time at the end of the presentation. And I thank you again for listening to me.
Thank you, Sarah. Very inspiring. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Micheal Falkowski. Micheal is a program manager at NASA. He's running the program that is called Wildland Fire, and it's based at the NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. And it focuses on facilitating the development of woodland fire technology, research, and related application. Before Micheal joined NASA, he was a professor for many years at different universities, including Colorado State University, from where he went to NASA. But before that, in Minnesota and Michigan. And Micheal also worked for the Canadian Forest Service and the Pacific Forestry Centre in Victoria, British Columbia, prior to his academic career. And as I mentioned before becoming an academician, Micheal also worked in the wildfire and prescribed fire crews. So he brings, obviously, hands-on experience. Micheal, all yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that introduction. I assume you can hear me well. All right, so as the dean mentioned, it's felt really good to come back into this type of position after having started my career after I finished undergraduate as a wildland firefighter. One of my first jobs after I finished my undergraduate degree was with a tribal organization in Wisconsin. I was a GIS technician for them, and they wanted me to be a GIS technician that would deploy to wildfires out west. And so I did all the firefighter training. And as part of that training, I was actually able to deploy on several fires out west, and then also help the tribe with some cultural burning and beneficial fire around the reservation. So it was a really nice way to start my career, and then spent 10 years as an academic and got the opportunity to come to NASA and eventually transition into running a wildland fire program. And so today's talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about fire and what we see in terms of fire in the global system. Talk about fire across a variety of spatial scales, including scales at which our firefighters in the audience operate at, some of the fires that we saw, just for example, in LA. And then talk about what's some of the things we're doing at NASA, specifically through the Wildland Fires program, to hopefully address some of these issues. So being at NASA, we, in the Earth Science Division, we often use space as a platform from which to study our Earth system, primarily through launching Earth observation satellites. At any given time, we have somewhere between 25 and maybe 30 plus or minus a few satellites in operations that were specifically designed to measure different components of the Earth system: atmospheric properties, land surface properties, ocean properties, cryosphere properties. And we can use them individually to study those different ecosystems or those different phenomena on the Earth's surface, or we can use them in conjunction with each other to get a more dynamic understanding of the interconnected nature of the Earth system. And when we think about fire, I'd be really hard-pressed to think about a satellite mission that didn't have an application in fire, especially when we think about fire across the fire life cycle. So that includes the pre-fire conditions that lead to fire risk, things like dry vegetation and weather patterns, atmospheric properties, that sort of thing. Of course, active fire detection and tracking, post-fire impacts to ecosystems, and then also air quality. This animation shows you a little bit of a snapshot of some of what these data sets look like. Again, these are from different satellite missions or models that are parameterized with satellite data to look at things like biospheric properties, so vegetation photosynthesis, things like soil moisture from our SMAP sensor, precipitation, global precipitation measurements now we can do at 30-minute timescales with our iMerge constellation, and then different weather and clouds properties. And so you can imagine, especially when we think about fire across the fire life cycle, how data sets like this could be useful to help understand fire risk and fire spread dynamics. And active fire is something that we've been measuring from space globally since the early 2000s, late 1990s, when we launched a satellite called Terra and Aqua. There's 2 different satellites and a sensor called MODIS. MODIS was specifically designed to measure land surface and ocean surface properties and some atmospheric properties as well, but some scientists decided to put some channels on there that were sensitive to thermal properties of wildland fire. And so what we're seeing here is something called fire radiative power. So it's the amount of heat coming off of a fire across the 2020 year. And you can see from this that our world burns a lot. Those patterns of burning change based on seasonality across the globe. And a couple of things to highlight is that the southern hemisphere actually burns a ton. You can see in South America that the Cerrado and the Amazon rainforest burn a lot. And then in Africa, a lot of the burning will shift north and south depending on the season of agricultural burning. So that's another thing that we've learned from studying data sets like this, is we understand that fires are mostly human-caused intentionally for either intentionally or unintentionally, but a lot of intentional fire for things like agricultural practices. And that's what you're seeing happen in Africa as well as other parts of the world, even in the southeastern United States. We can also measure things like air quality from space or take measurements from spaceborne sensors and then use them to parameterize air quality models. This is an example of carbon monoxide measurements from our GMAO group at NASA Goddard. This is a model output that was parameterized with satellite data looking at carbon monoxide from the Canadian wildfires back in 2023. I don't know if you all had negative air quality impacts down here from those fires, but certainly on the eastern seaboard, Washington, D.C. area, it was unprecedented. And so we can use our data sets to not only understand air quality, but also improve air quality forecasts, ultimately to help protect humans from the negative impacts of things like carbon monoxide. And then we can start to bring some of these satellite measurements down to local scales to hopefully help with operational fire management. This is an example of a wildland fire where we've taken our MODIS data that I showed you in a previous slide, and we're looking at those red triangles are individual hotspots detected by the satellites. This is from a fire in California. I think this is the Camp Fire from several years ago. And then what our scientists at NASA Goddard did was figured out how to take that hotspot data, use some artificial intelligence and machine learning to automatically derive where the fire perimeter might be. And then we can deliver data like this to the incident command fire posts on the ground so they can help use that to start to base some decisions about how they might allocate resources, firefighting resources on the ground. The other thing is we can start to learn what drives fire spread at these sort of landscape scales, and on what days do we see big fire spread rates and what might be driving those rates. Again, that can help with local firefighting operations. Now, when I talk about fire, I really need to make the distinction that there's really 2 different types of fire, and how we think about them really varies, and how we talk about them really varies based on the types of fire. So I was a wildland firefighter. Typically that means that we're talking about fires that are occurring out in forested or unforested ecosystems, sort of far away from populations, maybe 30 to 50 miles away from any major city. This is where most fires are. They can have really large burn impacts. Generally speaking, although they do have negative impacts on local communities and things like air quality, generally speaking, they have lower impacts on humans as compared to what we just saw in LA. These are easier to control, and in fact, somewhere about 82% of fires in the wildland fire category are suppressed according to initial plan. So we're able to put them out according to plan pretty effectively. Vegetation is the primary fuel, and as with most fires, they're primarily non-natural ignition. So we do get some lightning fires that start wildland fires, but again, fires are mostly human-caused, either intentionally or unintentionally. And then we have what just happened in LA or La Habana or the Marshall Fire in Colorado, the Camp Fire in California, community conflagrations. This is a relatively small number of fires in this category, but they have really outpaced impacts on humans. So you saw all the negative impacts on humans, structures, lives, livelihoods in LA. These are really typically what I would consider a wind event with fire in them. So you have a really intense weather system come in with really high winds. There's an ignition, and the fire starts, and it's almost nearly impossible to control. Firefighters, especially when you have 60, 70 mile an hour winds, really just kind of have to get out of the way and wait for those winds to die down before they can respond effectively. Houses and human-made objects are typically the fuel and not vegetation. And really, as compared to wildland fires, we really have poorly understood spread dynamics, how these fires will actually spread through communities. And again, primarily non-natural ignition. And so, again, when we talk about fire, we also have to think, when we talk about fire and fire impacts to ecosystems and humans, we really also have to think about this across different spatial and temporal scales, varying from seconds and days all the way up to millennia, and varying from the microsite level all the way up to the continental level. And so at this smallest spatial and temporal scale, from seconds and days to microsite and local, we have really combustion properties, things about fuel, oxygen level, and the amount of heat that really drive fire dynamics. And these really occur from days to years. These are where we as humans really, our perceptions of fire and the impacts that fires have on our homes or our ecosystems are really driven sort of at this sort of spatial scale. It's really hard for us to think outside of that sort of human experience box. But if we go up in spatial and temporal scale out to decades and centuries and look at regional levels, fires become more driven by things like local weather conditions, sort of regional climate patterns and regional vegetation patterns. And it becomes more difficult for us as humans to understand the impacts that these fires are having on things like ecosystems. But thankfully, we have a satellite record that goes back almost 50 years now in some cases that can help us sort of parse out some of the patterns that we're seeing in terms of fires at that sort of time scale and spatial scale. And then if we go out one more level, if we go up from centuries to millennia, we really have fires being driven by long-term climate variations, regional and some continental controls on weather, and then also persistence of biomes. And we have other tools in science to help us understand some of those patterns through paleoecology. And the point I want to bring home here is that when we think about fire in wildland systems, and I'm not talking about the community conflagrations yet, ecosystems are really resilient to fire across millennia. So this study here came out. It was a meta-study of a bunch of paleoecology studies where they looked at charcoal records in the soil and pollen records in lake sediments. And they looked at, from the charcoal records, how frequently ecosystems burned, which you see in that purple graph on the left, and then how persistent different ecosystem types were. And so this is from an area in Yellowstone National Park. And you can see, based on the pollen records, that about 14,000 years ago, maybe 12,000 years ago, it's a little hard for me to see, this ecosystem transitioned from a tundra type of ecosystem to a lodgepole pine forest. When that happened, if you look at the purple graph on the left, based on charcoal records, you can see that there was a big increase in fire frequency. And this area still burns today. It has burned a lot through the millennia, but it's still persistently a lodgepole pine forest. The ecosystem burns, it recovers, it comes back. When we experience these fires as humans, if you were around in 1988, is that when Yellowstone burned, the big one in the news? You remember how devastating that looked. I was just in Yellowstone maybe for the third or fourth time this past summer. And of course, there's evidence of fire there, but it's a functioning lodgepole pine forest. It has not changed. These ecosystems will come back. And this is just one example from a site in in Yellowstone and Wyoming, but the study that I cite here has several examples of this across the globe, and so that's a pattern that really emerges. And we can even see this at a shorter time scale. So this is a hike I took with my friend Ralph near Mount Hood this past summer. This is a fire that went through the coastal, or sort of this interior wet forest near Portland, Oregon, on the south side of, or north side of Mount Hood. This was the Dollar Lake Fire, I think, which burned in 2011. So we're about 12 years post-fire when Ralph and I were hiking through this fire. And you can see, if you look at the overstory, the trees, they were totally consumed. This was a high-severity fire. All the vegetation was burned off. Very devastating to that ecosystem and to the local community when that fire happened. But if you walk through there today, 12 years later, you see tons of tree regeneration, high diversity in different trees. They're doing really well. Some huckleberries, which are an important food source for wildlife, are 12, 13 feet tall. And so this ecosystem is thriving 12 years after the fire. And so, again, generally speaking, ecosystems are pretty resilient to fire even at shorter timescales. This is a time-lapse photo that Ralph took with a wildlife camera somewhere near there, and just showing you that, I don't know how many number of years after this particular fire happened that was taken, but you can see that, again, it's regrowing, it's doing just fine. This is another video near the Hood River Gorge, not far from that site, where Ralph has had time-lapse cameras, and again, you're seeing, this is a little sooner after the fire, but you're seeing avalanche lilies come in, and of course, wildlife are already thriving in here. This is Louis the elk. Ralph's got this guy on camera a bunch. So again, these ecosystems and the creatures that live in these ecosystems, even though the news will tell us and our own experience tells us that the fire was devastating, it really does come back, and creatures start to use it right away. But we are seeing changes in that in the recent years. And so what has happened in the United States, especially in like dry conifer ecosystems like Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, California, we have this historical record where these ecosystems would burn fairly frequently at low severity, low intensity. But then at around the early 1900s, we started to suppress fires to protect timber resources and for other reasons. And what has happened is now we're in a fire deficit. And so what used to be fairly open stands of trees that could tolerate sort of relatively frequent, actually, low intensity fires have now accumulated in terms of the amount of biomass or the number of trees in that system. We keep putting out fires. And so now when they do occur, they tend to be more intense because there's simply put more fuel to burn. And so now we're at this sort of this potential tipping point in the United States and other parts of the world that are experiencing similar dynamics, where we have a choice here. Do we continue with the process as is? Do we continue to keep putting out fires? Or do we try alternative models to try to get more fire on the landscape and try to get the ecosystem back into balance? And so that's a lot of the debate that's going on right now in the sort of the wildland fire management community. Here's another look at this. This is just a sort of photographic depiction of what I just showed. On the left would be a sort of what you might consider to be a historically representative ponderosa pine stand, and you can see that there's low intensity fire burning through the surface there. Firefighters are there. They're walking away. They don't seem to care. They may have set that intentionally as a prescribed fire. But because we've taken fire out of the system, we have all this vegetation growing, and there's just a lot of energy stored up in that system that, quite frankly, just needs to burn to get out of the system. And so when we have fires now, oftentimes, especially when the weather conditions are in a certain way, they become more explosive and more dangerous. There's also some evidence in the literature that suggests that because we're so good at suppressing fire, especially when weather conditions are pretty mild, that we're getting something called a fire suppression bias. We're putting out fires at times when they should be let to burn because they're going to be having really low impacts, beneficial impacts on the ecosystems, while we're not letting fires, or while we can't catch the fires that have the most severe impacts. And by doing this, we're removing fire from the system, again, contributing to more vegetation growth, ultimately leading to more intense fires. And so coming back to the satellite data a little bit, we can look at the satellite record and we can confirm some of what I just showed in the last 2 or 3 figures. We have Landsat, which is a satellite that's operated by the USGS but built by NASA. It's a NASA-USGS collaboration. It's been operating since the mid-1970s, but we can the newer version, or the more sort of the system that has the higher spectral fidelity starts in like 1984, and we can look at burned area from Landsat by doing an image before the burn and after the burn. This is from the Smokehouse Creek fire that happened in Texas about a year ago. A very devastating fire that spread really fast across the Texas and into Texas Panhandle. Had lots of negative impacts on ranchers and ranching, killed a bunch of livestock. But that's an example of a burned area image that we can get from Landsat. And we can go all the way back to 1984 in the Landsat record and look at annual burned area. And you can see this graph on the right, which is from the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho. They used Landsat data to look at burn area from 1984 to present. And you can see that indeed we are seeing an increase in burn area on an annual basis. So fires are getting bigger, confirmed by the satellite data. And we expect, given warming atmosphere, that we will see this trend continue. So this graph shows you some modeled output of something called vapor pressure deficit. So it's essentially measuring the dryness of the atmosphere. And so as the atmosphere becomes warmer and drier, it's able to essentially suck more moisture out of the vegetation and the soil, making those areas more flammable. And we can see that on the graph on the right, when we have increases in atmospheric dryness, as you're seeing here, we're also getting an increase in the fire size, as characterized by the dots in blue, which were our fire sizes from 1984 to 1999. And then we have the more recent record, last 20 years, where you're seeing indeed an increase in fire size as a function of higher vapor pressure deficit from a warming atmosphere. We expect those trends to continue as our atmosphere continues to warm. We can also use the satellite record to look at changes in fire intensity. So if we remember back to my third or fourth slide where I had the global fire cycle, all the burning in Africa and South America, measuring something called fire radiative power. That's the amount of energy coming off a pixel or a pixel that's on fire. What this study did here, which came out this year, is they looked at the MODIS record, which goes all the way back to the early 2000s, and they looked at fire radiative power for the 20% of the hottest fires globally. And again, you're seeing an increase in the amount of energy released by the fire across the satellite time record. And so, again, we're seeing more fire, the fires are bigger, and now from the MODIS data, we're demonstrating that the fires are hotter, they're burning more intense. Again, this is across a 20-year time record, so it's a little bit narrow, but it's definitely a decent tool for understanding contemporary fire dynamics. Another thing we're seeing, I mentioned wind earlier, but we're seeing an increase in what I would call extreme fire events or extreme wind events with fire in them. This is an animation on the left from the GOES satellite, which is a geostationary weather satellite operated by NOAA. This is from the 2020 Labor Day fires in Oregon and California. And so what happened here was we had several fires across the Pacific Northwest that were, burning at pretty low intensity. And then you had a series of typhoons. I think it was 3 typhoons that transited across the Pacific, starting in the Korean Peninsula, and then slammed into, or the weather pattern slammed into Western Canada, British Columbia. That caused the jet stream to dip really far south and created really high near-surface winds. At some places, they recorded sustained gusts of 80 to 100 miles an hour. And that animation on the right shows you those winds. And so what had happened is if you watch the animation is you can see the winds come across and these fires essentially just blow up once the high winds get there. And these fires were really devastating to communities, especially in Oregon. And we expect, again, with an increase in extreme events, to see more of these. This is like what we just saw in LA, for example, what we saw in Lahaina, where these high wind events. And again, this study just came out a couple of months ago. They used the MODIS satellite data to understand, or to determine that we're seeing what they call fast fires increasing in terms of number, but also in terms of how across this time record, the fires are actually becoming faster. And I mentioned earlier about wildland fires not causing a lot of economic damage as compared to these community conflagrations, and this study confirms that. They found that although fast fires accounted for a small number of fires, they accounted for nearly 80% of all the structures damaged and 61% of the suppression costs. And again, they're from this time record from 2001 to 2020, they're saying that they saw the growth rate of these fires nearly doubling. So not only are we seeing more fast fires, but they're getting faster, and they're also having the most economic impacts and negative impacts to humans. And as I mentioned earlier, these are the fires that are really hard to stop.
E19 from Helco, we're getting a 70 knot
let this play for a
We're going to
second.
have to shut down water dropping operations. Also, you can cancel that traditional copters. However, I will stay overhead for intel for you.
So this is from the fires that we just saw in LA.
Okay, copy that.
Really high winds to the point where they had to shut down aerial suppression operations. And we often see this in fast fires. Like I said earlier, when you have high winds, there's almost nothing firefighters can do. And even they have to stop, sorry. Shut out a little water up here, but I'll be all right. They have to stop aerial suppression operations. And again, this is some more videos from the Palisades fire.
Hit it and be all right. Get ready, okay?
And you can just see how difficult this would be for a firefighter to stop. You're seeing high winds.
On top of the house.
And you're seeing what we call ember casts. So all these sparks flying off of vegetation that will accumulate near the bases of houses and set them on fire. And then we have what we call a community conflagration, where the fire spreads from house to house to house. This is an image of a post-community conflagration in Paradise, California, which happened in 2018. And again, you can notice something really interesting here, and that is that the vegetation really didn't burn. All right, so in this kind of fire, trees are really not the problem. Shrubs are not the problem. It's something else is happening. Here's another example. I don't know what fire this was from, but again, this shows you that this idea that we have of fire being a wall of flames, like you might see in a wildland fire, is not the case in a community fire. You're getting these embers that go from house to house. You're getting long distance spotting, and the vegetation is largely left intact. And we think it's because we have these winds that are really going down quite intensely from the mountains, and it's piling up the embers at the base of houses, where the embers can pretty much flow through the tree canopy quite freely. So it's not a lost cause, though. There's a lot that we can do. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice for some reason. It could help, but we'll see. All right, thank you. Appreciate it. There's a lot that we can do to protect ourselves and protect our houses and our communities. So here we have an image of a house where a fire is approaching, but this particular homeowner took a lot of precautions to fireproof their home. They installed a metal roof. They removed vegetation near the house. They used a lot of concrete and rock. And you can actually see, if you look at this house in the lower left-hand corner, there's a firefighter sitting there that actually decided it was worth their time and their life to sit there and basically babysit this house through the fire because they knew it was savable. And so that's often a situation that our firefighters get into. They have to start doing triage. They have to decide which house is defendable, which isn't. What is the one where they could put their life on the line and know that they're going to have a high probability of success. And so this is where we're at in the United States right now. We're trying to figure out how to build more resilient communities by doing things like reducing fuels near communities, dealing with power lines. A lot of these fires are power line ignition, and so knowing when and where to shut down power lines, especially when these high winds come, can really help reduce the occurrence of these community fires, and then also building with more resilient building materials, materials that are more fireproof, for example, putting metal roofs on, putting screens on eaves. A lot of embers get into the eaves. If you put just a little mesh screen on there, you can prevent your house from burning down. In the wildlands, we can do things like thinning and prescribed fire to reduce fire impacts. And then we can also do something like what we're seeing on the right here is lighting a really large-scale prescribed fire to restore ecosystems. And I have a video of that in 1 second here. So I don't have many more slides here, but I want to talk a little bit about the program I run at NASA. And we're really in the business of developing technology in research and applications that improve the end-to-end management of wildland fire across the fire life cycle, really focusing to reduce the impacts that fires have on communities and the economy. And we work closely with wildland fire management agencies, researchers, and technology developers in the private industry and in, excuse me, and in government agencies. We have a lot of, I'll be all right, as long as you don't mind. We have a lot of projects in the United States, that's our footprint there, but we also have, international collaborations as well. So we do everything from developing foundational technology, thank you so much, and we conduct Earth system science with that technology, and we do applied research, but we're also really interested in transitioning technology into operations. So it's really, that's oftentimes the hardest part of the puzzle, is figuring out how do we get the technology and data sets that we develop into operational use. It turns out it's really difficult, and that's one of the projects that we have in our program called FireSense. I already mentioned MODIS. We've been doing the foundational technology development for a long time. The active fire data from MODIS are delivered globally across in a website called FIRMS. It's used by the U.S. fire management agencies, U.S. Forest Service, Department of Interior, often to do their daily planning, and it's used globally for fire science as well. We have many new missions, either in operations or coming soon, that can really help understand fire across the fire life cycle. So we have a vegetation LiDAR called JEDI. You can see the image of JEDI here on the right. That's measuring forest structure. We're looking at using that data for understanding the distribution of fire fuels. We have TEMPO, which just launched, which is an air quality sensor. We have some things on the International Space Station. Well, JEDI is, but also EcoStress, another thermal instrument. And then we're about to launch NISAR, which is a synthetic aperture radar that can do all sorts of things like look at vegetation structure, but also soil moisture and fuel moisture. And then going forward, we have a couple of hyperspectral missions, again, that can help us across the fire life cycle. Real quickly, I'll wrap up here in a couple of minutes, but I want to take a time to talk about the NASA FireSense project, which is really focused on transitioning that technology into operations, which is a really hard thing to do. We do this by working really closely from day one with stakeholders in the wildland fire management agencies in the United States at federal, state, local, and tribal levels. We engaged with them very early on to help us design this program and asked them specifically at what sort of barriers that they had integrating science and technology into their operational management protocols. And we've got projects in each of these 4 use cases in the pre-fire, active fire, and air quality environments. And this is really what we're trying to solve here, is this idea of trying to use a new model of technology and science co-development to help with getting technologies into operations. A lot of times what happens is we as scientists and engineers have really great ideas that are really driven by the science and the engineering. We come up with a great idea, we build a product or we do the research, and then we want to, at the end, we want to figure out how to get that into use, and that's when we talk to the stakeholder, and it's often too late. A lot of what we develop ends up in something called the valley of death because it's not quite built to purpose. We didn't think of something that the stakeholder needed, or they didn't know how to use it, or there's all sorts of reasons why technology can be end up in the valley of death, and it happens a lot. But we're trying with FireSense to embed the scientists and the engineers with the end users from day one, so they can co-develop and co-develop a use-inspired idea, collaboratively iterate through that process, and then hopefully that leads to more readily transitionable technology and science. So we've been doing a lot of this for a couple of years now, where we bring in our scientists and engineers with our transition partners, and they interact and they come up with ideas and they pitch proposals together, which we fund at NASA to get things over that transition hump through the valley of death. Part of this is doing airborne technology demonstration campaigns. So oftentimes we'll build the sensor as a prototype, for example. We'll deploy it on some of our aircraft with our operational end users in the field with us, so they can see how it works, start to work out some of the bugs. And we've been doing this for a few years now. We have a campaign coming up in Kennedy Space Center in Merritt Island, Florida, just in a couple of weeks here. I'll tell you more about that in 1 second. This is a video from our first campaign in the Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. We deployed out there a couple of falls ago. The Fish Lake National Forest is trying to do these large-scale aspen restoration projects. Aspen are a really important tree species for wildlife like elk and grouse, but because of fire suppression, they've been encroached with conifer trees, and the most effective way to regenerate aspen at large scales is to burn them at high intensity. And so they do these helicopter ignition fires, and then we have researchers out in the field collecting all sorts of data. Thank you. I'm making you all nervous. I'm fine, though. So we're able to take our aircraft and our field people out there to do all sorts of measurements and really test these technologies and demonstrate them in a situation that mimics what a wildfire might look like. We did another one in Montana this past fall, almost done here. The National Weather Service and the U.S. Forest Service are really interested in developing better weather forecasts at the local scale for active fire response operations. Typically, you might do this by deploying a weather balloon to take atmospheric measurements, but you can't do that on an active fire operation because the balloon will interfere with aerial suppression operations. And so what we tested was some new sensors, atmospheric sounding sensors on a Alta-X UAS that can fly up and down and under a controlled situation, so we can get really frequent measurements repeatedly. Also, a weather balloon floats away and you only get that. They're not recoverable. With our UAS, we can take very frequent measurements in a controlled setting to really provide more improved local weather forecasts to support firefighter safety. We're doing another one this summer. We have 3 balloons in the stratosphere deployed with basically they'll have a LTE communications payload on them to improve communications with firefighters. A lot of these fires out west are in remote areas where you don't have cell service. Sometimes the radios for the firefighters don't work. And so we're using the balloons to provide communications between the firefighters and the incident command posts, but we're also putting sensors on these balloons. We'll have a couple of thermal payloads. We might have a synthetic aperture radar. We did version 1 of this last summer, and we're able to send thermal data back to the incident command post in near real time, which was a real game changer for the fire response operations. And then finally, we'll be doing our spring campaign. One of them is up at Merritt Island Fish and Wildlife Refuge, which is part of Kennedy Space Center. The Fish and Wildlife Service burns up there a lot to reduce fuels, promote ecosystem health, but also protect space launch facilities for NASA, for the private industry, also for the Department of Defense. And so we have a multi-agency collaboration between NASA, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Department of Defense to go support, and then again have researchers from NASA and the DoD out in the field making measurements while our aircraft fly over to measure fire and smoke properties to help support operations. My last slide here. We also just funded a new Earth Venture suborbital campaign called NSPIRE, which is going to study pyrocumulonimbus clouds. Again, these are, I didn't really talk about these earlier, but pyro-CBs are these fire weather creating clouds that are really dangerous for firefighter safety. They're really hard to predict. We don't really understand the role that they play in their system fully yet, and so we're going to be doing a study with field measurements and aircraft to better understand pyro-CBs, and also hopefully develop models that can start to better predict what events might lead to pyro-CB formation, ultimately to help protect firefighters and local communities. So with that, I think I'm at time. I will stop for any questions you might have.
Pretty sad I can't get a fireman water when he needs it, right? We didn't have any pools local. We do, we've got one over there. Anyway, I just wanted to say scholarships at our university are very important to us, and I just wanted to put my name out there. If you have an interest or you'd like to help support our students here, either through the Opportunity Fund or the General Scholarship Fund, you can connect with me here. Our students are working in all of the 4 strategic areas at our priority areas for the Rosenstiel School: saving lives, feeding the world, unlocking ocean secrets, and protecting our marine resources. So you can take my number down, give me a call. If you would like to have a few minutes, we're going to do some questions from the audience here. We'll have our microphones. Our students are going to take them around. Please raise your hand. You'll get the microphone, ask your question, and then hand the microphone back to the student. And with that, we will take some questions from the audience.
See, this may be a little away from your area of expertise, but I was trying to think of the policy implications. Now, for the wildfires, it seemed like the policy ought to be that we not be so enthusiastic about putting out the little fires. But for the community fires, I was wondering, since it's not the vegetation that's important, it's things like structures and the like, should the mitigation be focused on things like regulation and insurance? And I mean, should we have the regulators say Los Angeles shouldn't rebuild the way they were? And should we have the insurance industry regulated in such a way that they're risk-based rates? I mean, how do you think we ought to deal with this?
That's a great question. You're right, a little bit outside of my area, but certainly something that we think about. Retrofitting houses, for example, or building back with better materials is something that could be done. You can imagine that that's really costly. I think the insurance companies are starting to do some of this naturally. Of course, you can read the news about insurance companies pulling out of California. They simply can't afford to insure there anymore because of the losses, right? And so I think it's going to take a little time, but I do believe that the policy and all of that will start to balance out at some point in time just through natural economics. But yeah, you're right. Even in the wildland case, a lot of the problems we face are that could be fixed with better policy. I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
Thank you very much. In fighting fires, or do you also look not only scientific but also some indigenous knowledge? How indigenous, like Navajo Nation or Cherokee, how they used to use their tacit knowledge in preventing fires, living in harmony with nature, and managing the fires? Like, do you also tap to indigenous knowledge?
Yes. There's a lot of discussion now about indigenous knowledge and what we can lean on to start to bring beneficial fire back into ecosystems. I didn't talk about it here, but we do have a collaboration with the Yurok tribe in Northern California who do a lot of cultural fire, beneficial fire for both community protection, but also to promote medicinal plants. And we're interested in not only learning from them, but also seeing, what can our technology help in terms of getting them to be able to put fire on the landscape. A lot of times they have permitting issues with CAL FIRE. They're not allowed to burn on certain days, but can we bring in data and technology to demonstrate to CAL FIRE, for example, that this is indeed a safe day to burn, by putting some numbers behind it. So that's a great point. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My question is similar to the question before about building houses better. Is there any research on building houses just further apart that's currently being done?
Yeah, so there was a couple of studies done years ago by an individual in the Forest Service named Jack Cohen who looked at a lot of that stuff, and he looked a lot at how far vegetation needs to be away from houses. So we have some of that data. It turns out maybe even 30 feet is enough of a separation in terms of houses and vegetation. We know things like attached fences or attached wood fences or anything like wood piles near houses are a bad idea. I'm not sure about proximity of houses themselves, but it's a good question.
You work for a federal agency. Mm-hmm. And many of the agencies that you referred to throughout your presentation were federal. So in lieu of what's happening now with all this aggressive cost cutting, Are you feeling on your heels? Do you feel the impact already? Do you have just sort of comments on how you think it's going to impact all this work?
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I think we're all a little curious and being cautious. You know, like I mentioned, the field campaign that we're having up in Merritt Island, you know, if we have a government shutdown on the 14th, or if some of my colleagues, you know, lose their jobs or funding's cut, that's not going to happen, right? And so I think we're just in a sort of wait and see position. We at NASA are, you know, we're feeling pretty good, and yeah, we tend to be resilient across administrations, but that's not always the same in every other agency. So yeah, I think we're in a kind of a wait and see sort of situation. I think something like wildland fire is like, it's a really important topic no matter who you are. So you know, I feel pretty secure in that position, but I don't know what'll happen.
Hi, Michael. I was just a bit thinking about how you were talking about the MODIS data graph. You were talking about the last 20 years of data. Is your team trying to make decisions based on a 20-year minuscule time period compared to, I mean, you know better than me how old this planet is. Mm-hmm. You don't have that data. You don't have even data from 200 years or 500 years. So isn't your window of time for analysis a bit small? And I'm sure you have a lot of statisticians in your team, and sometimes those tail events can be kind of obscure, and you may be making decisions based on a normal distribution that is not. So I'm just want to pick your brain.
No, I agree with you 100%, and that's kind of why I wanted to show this slide and the slide after it, acknowledging that the satellite record is really pretty narrow. And yes, we should be very careful to draw inferences just from the satellite record. We need to use other pieces of evidence. So here's where paleoecology can start helping us. And in fact, if you look at this, the one on the left, the purple one, that's fire frequency. You can see like 10,000 years ago, we were burning a lot more than we are today, right? And so we do have to be careful with how we interpret the satellite record and draw inferences, because it is just a narrow point in time compared to the millennia that you see on this graph here. But we have models that can help us do that at different scales, right? Different spatial and temporal scales.
I have a question about control burns. We were in New Mexico in 2000 for the Los Alamos, and that was a control burn that just got completely out of hand.
Yep.
What are your feelings about control burns?
I think we need them. I think we need to have better tools to make decisions about when and when not to burn with more data. Certainly in retrospect, you can look at the weather patterns after they happened, and you can see that you probably shouldn't have done that. So we need better predictive tools. Hindsight's 20/20, but hopefully we can get to a position where we have better predictions to be able to support, because we need more fire on the landscape that burns at low to moderate intensity if we're going to deal with this problem.
That would be it.
All right, thank you.
One more?
Oh.
One more, please. Recently in the California fires, there was a small house built to withstand the fires, and it did. Do you have any idea what the content or the materials were? How would it compare to current day? And do you think it would become a law or a rule that those fireproof houses have to be used in the future?
Yeah, I don't know about that particular house, but certainly there are materials that can be used to be more resistant to fire. Concrete burns less than wood, for example. I think it would be a good idea to start getting in some building codes to help regulate that. I think there are some in California, but they're hard to implement. I think when a fire like what happened in LA is over, you can imagine the community wants to rebuild really quickly. It's like human nature to want to come back, and they want to do it fast, and so they don't often have that forethought or that foresight to take a step back and think how to do it right. So we'll see. This is an opportunity to do something maybe a little different, but again, that's really hard.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this great presentation. As always, this will be on our YouTube channel in the next few days and also on Facebook. Please join us for the fourth lecture of the season. That is March 18th, featuring James Harrell, and that will conclude tonight. Thank you.